Scary telling.
I had a neighbor who was a lovely old man. His name was Mr. Wilson, and he would always be working in his garden whenever I walked past his house. We would often stop and chat about the weather, his plants, or anything that came to mind. I enjoyed talking to him and looked forward to our conversations. One day, as I was walking home from work, I saw Mr. Wilson in his garden and waved hello. But he didn't respond. He just kept tending to his plants, almost as though he hadn't heard me. I thought it was odd, but didn't want to bother him, so I continued on my way home. A few days later, I noticed a removal van and some people outside Mr. Wilson's house. I approached them and asked what was going on. They told me that Mr. Wilson had gone hiking a week ago and had a heart attack. They had only just recovered his body. He had been dead for a week. I was shocked. I had seen him just days earlier, alive and well, tending to his garden. I couldn't believe it. I asked the people if they were sure it was Mr. Wilson, and they confirmed it. They even showed me a picture of him, and it was him. The same old man I had spoken to many times before. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I felt as though I had seen a ghost. But I pushed it to the back of my mind and went about my day. That night, I had a nightmare. I was walking past Mr. Wilson's house, and he appeared in front of me, looking pale and sickly. He didn't say anything, just stared at me with cold, dead eyes. I woke up sweating and shaking. Over the next few days, strange things began to happen. I would hear strange noises coming from Mr. Wilson's house, even though it was empty. Sometimes I would see his figure out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, he wasn't there. And every night, I would have nightmares about him. One night, I decided to investigate. I went over to Mr. Wilson's house and tried to open the front door, but it was locked. I looked through the windows and saw that everything was in order. The furniture was still there, and the plants in the garden were still being watered. But it felt as though something was off. That's when I noticed something strange. In one of the windows, I saw a figure standing there, watching me. It was Mr. Wilson, or at least, his ghost. He was staring at me with those cold, dead eyes, just like in my nightmare. I stumbled back, terrified, and ran home. But that was just the beginning. Every night, Mr. Wilson's ghost would haunt me, appearing in my dreams and sometimes even in my waking hours. He seemed angry, like he was blaming me for something. But I didn't know what. Then one night, as I was walking past his house, I heard a voice calling out to me. It was Mr. Wilson's voice, and it was coming from inside his house. I hesitated for a moment but then decided to investigate. I opened the door and stepped inside. It was dark, but I could see a figure sitting in the living room. It was Mr. Wilson, or at least, his ghost. He looked at me, and I could sense his anger and frustration. "I need your help," he said, his voice hollow and eerie. "What can I do?" I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. "You need to find my journal," he said. "It's hidden in my bedroom, under the floorboards. I need you to burn it. It contains secrets that must never be revealed." I was hesitant to accept, but the desperation in his voice convinced me. I nodded and made my way to his bedroom. It was dark, and the air was cold. I could feel Mr. Wilson's ghost following me, his presence almost suffocating. I found a loose floorboard and lifted it up. Underneath, I found an old, leather-bound journal. I hesitated for a moment before picking it up. But as soon as I did, I heard a loud, guttural growl. I turned around, and there he was. Mr. Wilson's ghost was now standing right in front of me. His eyes were glowing red, and his skin was rotting away. I could smell the stench of death emanating from his body. "You should have never come here," he growled. "Now, you'll never leave." I tried to run, but his ghostly form was blocking the door. I was trapped. I could feel his icy hands closing on my throat, suffocating me. And then, everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying on the ground outside Mr. Wilson's house. The sun was shining, and the birds were singing. It all felt so normal, so ordinary. But I knew that it was far from it. I never went back to Mr. Wilson's house after that. But sometimes, in my dreams, I can still feel his ghostly presence. He haunts me, reminding me of the secrets he took with him to the grave. And I know that I'll never be free of him, not until I burn his journal and release him from his torment. But I'm too scared to do it. I don't want to unleash his anger and wrath upon the world. So, I live with the knowledge that I carry a dark secret, one that could destroy everything I hold dear. And every night, I pray that Mr. Wilson's ghost will leave me alone and let me live my life in peace. I've always been terrified of driving at night, especially on long, winding roads surrounded by dense forests. It all stems from a story my aunt used to tell me when I was a child, a Swedish urban myth about the Screech Mayas. According to the legend, they are the spirits of abused women who come out of the woods and jump in front of cars to make the drivers swerve and crash, seeking revenge on the living for the wrongs committed against them. I always dismissed it as a silly old wives' tale, but that all changed one fateful night. It was late and I was driving home from a friend's house, taking a shortcut through a rural area surrounded by dense woods. The moon was full and bright, casting eerie shadows across the road. I felt a chill run down my spine as I thought of the Screech Mayas and their revenge-seeking ways. As I drove, my eyes darted around, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. I was on high alert, my heart racing, my palms sweaty. Suddenly, something darted up from the trees and ran across the road, causing me to swerve and lose control of the car. I spun out of control, crashing into a ditch and hitting a tree. I was dazed and disoriented, but thankfully not seriously injured. I stumbled out of the car, trying to catch my breath and assess the damage. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural moaning coming from the woods. I felt a surge of fear wash over me, and I knew I had to get out of there. I stumbled back to my car and tried to start it, but the engine wouldn't turn over. I was trapped, alone and vulnerable, with whatever was making that terrible noise creeping closer and closer. Suddenly, I saw a figure emerge from the darkness, a woman with matted hair and a torn, blood-stained dress. She was hunched over, her fingers twisted into claws, her eyes glowing with a sinister light. I froze, unable to move or speak. She let out a piercing scream, and I felt my eardrums shatter. It was the most terrible sound I had ever heard, a mixture of agony, rage, and grief. I knew then that I was face to face with a Screech Maya. I closed my eyes and braced myself for the worst, but when I opened them again, she was gone. The forest was silent once more, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the wind. I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed with fear, but eventually, I managed to start the car and get back on the road. I drove home in a daze, my mind racing with questions and doubts. Was it real? Or just my imagination? Was I hallucinating, or had I really come face to face with a vengeful spirit? To this day, I don't have the answers. But what I do know is that I will never forget that night, the night I came face to face with the Screech Mayas and lived to tell the tale. I never believed in ghosts until the day I saw one. It happened when I was a child, but the memory has stayed with me my whole life. It all started with a story my dad used to tell me about when he was just a little boy. He was out for a walk with his father when he suddenly stopped in his tracks and said, "I just saw Grandma. She was waving goodbye." His father brushed it off as his imagination, but 2 minutes later, they received a call that my grandfather's mother had passed away. The story always gave me goosebumps, and I couldn't help but wonder if it was true. So, when I inherited my grandparents' house after they passed away, I was curious to see if anything strange would happen. At first, everything seemed normal. But then, one night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. I assumed it was just my imagination, so I tried to go back to sleep. But then, I heard a faint voice whispering my name. I froze in fear, too scared to even move. The voice sounded so familiar, but I couldn't place it. I lay there in silence, too afraid to even breathe. Suddenly, the door to my bedroom creaked open, and a figure appeared in the doorway. It was an old woman, dressed in a long white nightgown. She looked just like the pictures I had seen of my grandmother. I couldn't believe my eyes. My grandmother had passed away years ago, so how could she be standing right in front of me? I rubbed my eyes, thinking it must be a trick of the light. But when I opened them again, she was still there. I tried to speak, but my voice caught in my throat. The old woman just stood there, staring at me with a sad expression on her face. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I knew that something was terribly wrong. Then, without warning, the old woman vanished into thin air. I was left alone in the dark, feeling more frightened than I had ever felt before. For the next few nights, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the old woman's face staring back at me. I felt like I was going crazy, and I didn't know what to do. But then, one night, I heard a familiar voice whispering in my ear. It was my grandmother's voice, and she was telling me that everything was going to be okay. I felt a warm presence beside me, and I knew that she was there with me, even though I couldn't see her. From that moment on, I felt a sense of peace. I knew that my grandmother was watching over me, and I didn't have to be afraid anymore. The memory of that ghostly encounter still haunts me to this day, but it's also a reminder that love never truly dies. I never believed in ghosts until the night I stayed over at my aunt's house. She told me a story about her husband, who would often wake up in the middle of the night hearing strange noises. He would hear footsteps or chains dragging on the floor, and on some occasions, he would feel like someone was watching him. But one night, it all became too real for him. He woke up in the middle of the night, feeling as though he was being choked by an invisible force. He struggled to breathe as he tried to fight off the ghostly attacker, but there was nothing there. The next day, he had bruises on his throat. I scoffed at the story, thinking it was just a figment of his imagination. But that night, I found myself waking up in the middle of the night, feeling like someone was in the room with me. I looked around, but there was no one there. I tried to go back to sleep, but the feeling of being watched never left me. As I lay there in bed, I heard the sound of chains dragging across the floor. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but the sound grew louder and louder until it was right next to my bed. I froze, too scared to move or make a sound. Then, I felt something wrap around my neck, tightening its grip with each passing moment. I struggled to breathe, but it was like there was an invisible force constricting my airways. Panic set in, and I realized that I was being choked by a ghost. I fought against the ghostly attacker with all my might, but it was no use. I could feel myself slipping away as the grip around my neck tightened. Suddenly, the room was filled with a blinding light, and the ghostly presence disappeared. I lay there, gasping for breath, trying to comprehend what had just happened. The next day, I had bruises on my neck just like my aunt's husband. From that night on, I never stayed over at my aunt's house again, and I never scoffed at the idea of ghosts again. Now, every time I hear the sound of chains dragging on the floor or the feeling of being watched in the middle of the night, I can't help but wonder if that ghostly presence is still out there, waiting to attack its next victim. I never believed in curses or supernatural occurrences until that night when my mom, a firefighter, suffered from a heart attack. It was her night off, and we were sitting in the living room, watching TV, when she suddenly clutched her chest and collapsed on the floor. I dialed 911, and as I was waiting for the ambulance, I noticed something strange. The toaster on the kitchen counter, which had been unplugged and turned off, started to emit a strange glow, and a small flame flickered inside it. I immediately grabbed the fire extinguisher and put it out, but the whole incident left me feeling unsettled. My mom recovered, but something changed in her. She became withdrawn and fearful, refusing to talk about the incident or the strange occurrence with the toaster. I couldn't blame her. After all, she had spent her entire life fighting fires and had never seen anything like this before. Days turned into weeks, and life seemed to return to normal, but things were not what they seemed. Soon after my mom's incident, strange things started happening in our house. We would wake up in the middle of the night to find doors and windows open, despite having locked them before going to bed. Items would move around the house, and strange noises would wake us up from deep sleep. At first, we thought it was just our imagination playing tricks on us, but the incidents kept happening. One night, I woke up to find my mom's bedroom door wide open. I went inside to check on her, and as I was closing the door, I saw a strange figure standing in the corner of the room. It was dark and shadowy, and I couldn't make out any features, but I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, but the incidents continued and things escalated. One day, while my mom was out, I was in the kitchen, making myself a cup of coffee when the toaster started to glow again. This time, the flame inside it was much bigger and more intense. I watched in horror as the toaster levitated off the counter and flew across the room, crashing into the wall. I knew then that something was terribly wrong, and I had to take action. I did some research and discovered that there was a curse on firefighters, that anyone who worked in that profession would be haunted by the ghosts of those who had died in fires. These spirits would seek revenge on those who had not saved them and would never rest until they had been appeased. I realized then that the curse had found us, and it was up to me to break it. I contacted a paranormal investigator who confirmed my suspicions and helped me perform a ritual to lift the curse. We burned sage, salted the corners of the rooms, and chanted ancient prayers, hoping to appease the spirits and lift the curse. The ritual worked, and the strange occurrences stopped. My mom returned to her normal self, and life returned to normal. However, I still can't shake the feeling that the curse might come back. I now live in constant fear of what might happen next and wonder if the curse is truly lifted or just waiting to strike again. The firefighter's curse is real, and it's not something to be taken lightly. I learned the hard way that supernatural forces can be more powerful than we ever imagined, and that sometimes even the bravest of us can be brought down by the unknown.